What's up guys, and welcome to Bonnie Inku's Beginner's Guide to Mini Painting. Today we're going to be answering a question that I've been getting a lot lately, which is how can I get an airbrush-like effect without actually using an airbrush? So to answer this, we're going to cover 4 different blending methods which can be used as alternatives to airbrushing. To start things off, we need to pick some colors to blend together. In this video, we're going to use Coal Black and Frostbite, both from P3. I chose to use these colors because one, they've got really intense contrast between them. We got a really dark color and a really light color. I also chose to use these because these are colors used in the Oni of Skulls video. Now that we've got our colors picked out, let's do an airbrush example to see what we're trying to mimic. So I've already put some flow improver and distilled water in there. We're going to take some Frostbite. We're going to take this little towel that I've already covered in Coal Black, and we're going to spray it and create a nice transition. There we go. Now we have an example towel for what we're aiming for. This is kind of what you do on a miniature where you have the base coat, which is kind of a darker color, and you're trying to do a highlight or something, right? You can also do it the other way where it's like you have a highlight and you're trying to do the shadow, but I feel like most of the time people are doing the shadow to the highlight. So we're going to focus on that today, but all these different blending methods can be applied both from light to dark and from dark to light. So now let's look at the different blending methods to see how we can reproduce this effect, or at least get pretty dang close to it. So the first blending technique we're going to go over is what I like to call a wet dry brush, which doesn't really make sense, but I don't really know what it's officially called. Basically, we're going to follow the same process as we would dry brushing, where we get paint on the brush and then wipe most of it off, but unlike dry brushing where we wipe it on the cloth until it's completely dry and there's only dry paint left, we're going to leave some of the paint still wet inside the brush so that it helps kind of smear around and make a transition. So to do this, we're first going to grab another towel and we're going to give it a base coat of Coal Black. Alright, so now we have our Coal Black base coat. We're going to take some Frostbite, put it on our palette, and then start doing some wet dry brushing. Then we're going to grab a flat brush, which I just used this flat brush that I got in a combo pack off Amazon. It's just synthetic brush, nothing special. And get it all wet. And then grab our towel and we'll wipe off most of it. Then we'll do a little test and see it's still kind of damp. So we'll take our towel and basically just run it on there. Kind of just blending it on. Kind of more lightly hitting the areas that we want to keep remain darker, and then more heavily hitting the edge where we want to be brighter. Eventually, this will build up a kind of semi-dirty transition, but I think it actually works pretty good. Then we'll go get a little bit more paint. Once again, kind of dab most of it off. Check it. That's fine. And keep running on the towel. Let's make sure to let it dry in between applications. Speed it up with a little bit of airbrush. Or you can use a hairdryer. I just use this because it's easy. Already got it right there, might as well use it. And it's quieter, it doesn't wake up my kid. Now keep in mind, this tile is slightly textured. So that's why it's kind of picking up all these little ridges and stuff. On a flatter surface or on your guys, that's actually going to be desirable. Like for example, if we look at the Oni of Skulls, which let me go grab him real quick. Here we go, we got the Oni of Skulls. So he's got all these little like ridges and stuff on his muscles. As you're like doing this blending, it's going to pick out some of those, which will later actually help you highlight. So on normal figure, that's not going to be a big deal, and on flat surfaces, it's not going to have those little ridges. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at this example. You know, each model is going to be different, but most of the time, a flat surface, this is going to be nice and smooth. We're on a model. It's going to help pick out those areas just like a normal dry brush, and will actually help you later. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so there we go. There you got a bit of a blend. If you wanted to, we could take some coal black and go the opposite direction. So again, testing it, looks good. So there we go, we kind of got that done. You could go back and forth between the light and the dark, get this more smooth if you'd like to. Also, it'll be easier again on a smoother surface like we talked about a little earlier. But comparing that to that, it's definitely a rougher look than the straight airbrush. But that's okay, most of the time this more rough transition isn't going to be a big deal, because you're either going to be working on a flatter surface, or you're going to be working on something that's so small that the rough transition isn't going to matter. Because most likely, you're going to be working over top of it anyway, adding additional layers and washes that are going to kind of smooth this out. This was actually one of the first methods that I used in trying to make an airbrush-like effect. I used it on this cutout war jack, and you can see here, I did a darker coat underneath, and then up here, I used that wet dry brushing technique to create a nice blend. And you can see out here, the armor is a lot smoother, so you don't get those, you don't get those crazy bumps and stuff like you do on this tile. Out of all the blending methods, this is probably the quickest and easiest to do, although it's also the messiest. So keep that in mind as you're deciding between these blending methods, but again, like you can see here, it can actually produce a pretty good effect if you do it right. Alright, so the next method we're going to cover is known as glazing. Glazing is simply thinning a paint so that when it's applied to a model, it slightly tints the surface beneath. Because of this, glazing requires multiple layers to get a strong effect. Some people shy away from it because it takes a bit longer, but I personally really enjoy this effect. I use this on the Serpent Clan, the Oni of Skulls, and pretty much any application that I want to get a really smooth transition, I tend to go towards glazing. Making a glaze is pretty simple. Basically, we're going to take our paint, which for this application, we're going to take our frostbite, and then add in a bit of water and medium. So I like to use Les Bursley's wash base, which is a 50-50 mix of a water fluid mix and matte medium, and also add in some additional distilled water for certain colors. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to open up our frostbite, get a brush full, and put it on our palette. Then I'm going to take the wash base, and I tend to usually put about 3 to 4 drops. Then mix that up, and then we'll see how thin the paint is. So we can do a little test on this area. I'll probably go a little bit thinner. So with that, I'll add a little bit of water. And continue to mix it up. So basically we're just going to keep following this process, adding more wash base and water until we get a mix that's fairly thin and only slightly tints the surface beneath. One thing that's really important to note is the reason we add this wash base in there is because it contains this matte medium, which matte medium is just pigmentless paint. Because as we're thinning paints, like if we were to take this frostbite and just thin it with distilled water, at some point the pigment would start to separate, which is not what we want. In order to help counteract that and let us thin the paint even further to make it really transparent, we add in this matte medium. And then here we also have this water fluid mix, which just helps keep the application really smooth. So when I'm making glazes, I always add in some wash base. So my most common ratio for making glazes tends to be about 1 drop paint to 3 drops wash base, and usually just a drop of water. That usually ends up being just about right. Some paints are a little thicker or a little thinner and require different ratios, but most of the time the 1 to 3 to 1 ratio works just fine. So once we get that pretty thin, we can take our thumbnail and see how thin it's going to be. So you can see that's pretty thin. And with this is a really light color, so this is white. White tends to be really hard to glaze, but it is possible. So we're just going to we're going to thin this one just a little bit more to see if we can get it a little more transparent. And that is better. You can see how that just barely tints on my finger now. Once you get that glaze to the right consistency, we're going to get most of the glaze out of our brush, because this tends to be pretty runny and we don't want it just to run out of control. Then we'll grab our tile, which I've already base coated in coal black, and we're just going to run our brush from the area we want to remain darker to the area that we want to remain brighter. Because as we lift off with the brush, it's going to leave a little bit of paint right there on the end. So all we're really going to do is we're going to take this brush and sweep it down into that corner. Which, as you can see, it leaves that little deposit of paint. Which, since we're wanting to go down to the corner, we're going to sweep it down that way. Then we let that dry, which I always tend to speed it up with an airbrush because I don't like waiting for it. Okay, and then apply another layer. And we're just going to keep doing this until that transition is built up. And each time we apply it, we're going to apply it a little bit closer to that area we want lighter. So again, we just applied it right there the first time. So the second time, we're going to go in a little bit closer. So here you can see we're wrapping up the glaze effect. We probably apply between 25 and 30 different layers. You can see we're getting a really nice gradual effect. So if we look at this compared to our airbrush is of course super smooth, and our glaze is pretty smooth as well. Granted, this tile is a little bit bumpy and stuff, so it's not quite as smooth as it would be on a normal application where you have like a smooth surface, but it's still pretty good. You can see how we made a very gradual transition from the dark to the light, and how those very thin layers helped us get that really smooth transition. Out of all the blending methods, glazing is probably the slowest, and it takes the longest amount of time and patience, but I tend to really like it, especially on smaller areas. It just works really well. Creates a nice smooth blend, and it's just basically just patience applying a bunch of layers and letting it dry. So if we look at an example of glazing on a miniature, we've got our Oni of skulls that we just did the tutorial for. And I did a bunch of glazing right here on his little loincloth thing. So basically right here, I'd take the glaze and apply it here, drag it down towards the bottom, let that dry, and then apply another coat. Down, apply it down the bottom, let that dry, apply another coat. And eventually, you get these nice smooth blends all the way up to the raised areas. You can also see it here on the front. Maybe a little bit better, where you can see it goes from dark to light. All that was done with glazes. So the third blending method is known as two brush blending, or sometimes I like to call it damp brush blending, because I tend to use just a single brush to do this. However, the most common way is of course using two brushes. The first brush is used just to apply the paint to the miniature, and the second brush is just a clean damp brush that you're going to use to push and pull the paint around on the miniature and create the transition. However, you can also do this with just a single brush, which I tend to do a lot because I don't feel like using a second brush. We'll demonstrate the two brush blending way first, and then we'll show just a single one. But before we get going doing that, we need to get our paints ready. So to do this, you generally already have your base coat. So we've got our tile that's already painted coal black, just like before. Then we're going to grab our paint that we're going to blend on, and we're going to add a little bit of glaze medium, or what I like to call blending medium, because most of the time I don't actually use this for making glazes, though you can if you want. All glaze medium really tends to be, whether you buy from the store or make it yourself like I do, is it's some sort of drying retarder, which I like to use Liquitex Slow Dry, and then some sort of flow aid mix, which just helps the paint flow really smooth. So we're going to take our paint, grab our palette, and then we're going to grab a bit of paint. So we're going to get some paint, put it on our palette, and then we'll just add a drop or two of this glaze medium. And also, depending on the paint, you may need to add a drop or two of water, just like you normally would when thinning your paints. Then blend that together. What this will do is we'll get us a nice paint that will be really smooth, and we'll also slow the drying time a little bit so we have extra time to make the blend. So we're going to take our towel, and for the two brush method, we're going to take some paint and we're going to apply it to our corner. We'll then take our damp brush and we're going to move it back and forth. Let's get a little more damp. And we're going to take our damp brush and we're just going to move it back and forth until we move it into the paint. And then we'll pull the paint away until we start making that transition. And you can kind of rinse it out, bring it back, and repeat to strengthen or weaken the effect. And basically what that's going to do is as you move the brush into the paint, you're going to pick up the pigment, and then as you move it away, it's going to distribute that pigment until eventually you're only going to have a little bit left, and it'll make that nice transition. Again, this application is going to be a little more difficult and not quite as smooth because of the textured surface, but on your miniatures with really flat areas, it's going to look just fine. Sometimes with this method, you tend to get the blend a little higher than you'd like. I tend to do this all the time, so I tend to go back and take the darker part, do the same thing where we grab some paint, add a little bit of water and glaze medium to it, and then just two brush blend the other way. And then here we'll show the single brush method. So we got our paint on our brush. So we're gonna apply it, then rinse out the brush, wipe it on a towel or whatever you got. And do the same thing, run the paint brush up into the paint and then down into the area you want to blend. You can also do it where you apply the paint, and then instead of working the paintbrush in, you can just start at the very strong area. Just pull the paint away. So there we go. We're going to call this good. You could definitely go back and forth a little bit more if you want to get the transition a little bit smoother. If we compare this to our airbrush, we can see it's not bad. We definitely could get it a little bit smoother, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm not going to worry about it too much. Again, on your mini, it's going to be a lot smoother. For an example of this, I did this on the Oni of Hate, right here on his little cloak thing. So I had it really dark, and then I two brush blended on this little brighter area. So I basically applied the paint up here. So applied the paint, and I took my brush, moved it back and forth, and then pulled it down to here. So you can see really nice how that actually looks on a mini. It's a whole lot smoother there than it is on this tile, but still not bad. You get the idea. This is a very common technique. I use it all the time. It makes really smooth blends, and usually it's pretty easy, especially on like a figure like this, where you just have like a little area that you want to easily create a transition. It's a lot faster to two brush blend this than it is to try and glaze it and put like 20 layers on there. So that is two brush blending. And finally, the last technique we're going to cover is called wet blending. In wet blending, we're going to prep the paints the same way we did with the 2-brush blending method. We're going to apply some paint to the palette, add a little extra glaze medium so we get that slow retarder and that flow-aid mix. And then we're going to do that with both colors. So then we're going to take our tile and we're going to apply each of the paints to the tile one at a time. So we're first going to apply some coal black. Just kind of throw it on there. Rinse out the brush. Then grab our frostbite and apply that right next to it. Right up to the line. If we need, get a little extra coal black and throw it on there. And then rinse out our brush, and then we take our wet brush. And there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can take the paint and kind of blend it together like this, where you kind of do it similar to how we did with the 2-brush blending method, where you just kind of blend it back and forth, pulling the paint. Which, as you can see, kind of makes that transition right there in the middle, but at times kind of makes it hard to control where the blend stops and where it begins. Another way of doing this is, again, apply both paints to the model, or in this case our little tile. Just throw it on there. Throw on the second color. Give your brush a rinse. And then instead of taking your brush and pushing and pulling it together, you instead take your brush and go in streaks, blending it together in the center. Just kind of go like there, grabbing a little bit of that, pulling it over, putting a little more coal black if needed. Just kind of grab the paint and blend it together. Also, one thing I tend to do quite a lot is actually take the paint and you get this nice transition in the middle, but then sometimes on the end you don't quite get the effect quite as strong as you want. So sometimes I'll come in and add the paint, and then instead of worrying about adding the second color, I'll just rinse out my brush. Kind of use that same method to just kind of move the paint and transition it over. That way I'm leaving the darkest area of paint alone, letting it sit there and dry, but still hoping that transition and moving the paint around a little bit. And there we go. We've now got our blend nice and smooth from light to dark. So again, if we take this and compare to our airbrushing, not bad. Got a nice smooth transition from light to dark, just like here. Probably would have been a little more similar had we gone back with our airbrush and gone dark to light, because that gives us a little bit different of a transition like I mentioned at the beginning. Now once again, let's look at this on an actual model. So set this aside right here. And I actually use this method quite a lot on this fire on the Oni of Skulls. So basically, I would do this. I would apply a little bit of dark paint, a little bit of the paint underneath, and I just take the brush, of course I use a little bit smaller one, and just kind of blend it like here, blend it together. And then take it over here, same thing here. So apply a little bit of paint on the tip, apply the blue paint down here, rinse out the brush, and then just kind of blend it in right there till we got a nice blend. And you get that resulting really nice blend and really nice looking fire. So to wrap things up, let's look one more time at all the results from all the different blending methods, starting first with our wet dry brush. Once again, this is the quickest and kind of dirtiest method, but definitely one that works pretty well. Then we got our glazing, which is again creating really thin transparent layers that slightly tints the surface with each application. This method was once again the longest of all the methods, but in my opinion produces really good results. We then had some 2-brush blending, which in my opinion is best on very small surfaces, because like we saw during the application, it's a little hard to control where the paint stops, and when you let that brush off of the area, it leaves that little splotch, which tends to be a little difficult to control. But still a really good blending method. I particularly like it on smaller areas, not so much the bigger areas. For those, I tend to stick with wet blending, because with wet blending, let's rotate that cube, you can control a lot more where your brightest area is, where the darkest is, and what area you're actually going to blend. Because you're taking that brush, you're only moving the paint where you want it. So there you have it, guys. There's all 4 blending methods all together compared to the airbrushing. Again, we got wet dry brushing, glazing, 2-brush blending, and wet blending. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and saw something new that you liked. Now be sure to get out there and try these things out, figure out which one you like, and paint some awesome minis. Thank you guys for joining. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram pages for extra bonding and goodness. See you guys on the next one. Bondaroo out!